Welcome to the program. Today we talk about parenting in the modern world. What's changing? What hasn't? What trends actually matter in this space? It's an extremely complex topic. There are many dimensions to it, and we could do hours of shows, and in fact, there are entire podcasts with many seasons dedicated to the topic. So what we try to accomplish in this episode is sort of a state of parenting in 2025 and what it means for all of the other trends that we cover on this program, demographic trends and the implications that has on global economics, local economics, on society as a whole, on culture, on even things as far-reaching as geopolitics. It's important to understand from the individual parent's perspective what challenges they're facing, and instead of assuming that we have all the answers for why things are happening, why don't we stop to ask the questions from those who are making those decisions in their life and who are leading communities of conversation around the topic. So with that in mind, we were able to secure a wonderful guest for this conversation, journalist and mother herself, Zara Hanawalt, a Chicago-based writer whose work on parenting, women's health, work, and culture has appeared in a wide variety of outlets including Vogue, Marie Claire, Glamour, Cosmopolitan, Parents, Shape, Motherly, and The Every Mom. She also co-hosts the podcast Do You Want the Truth? I love that title, which pulls back the curtain on real stories of fertility, of pregnancy, and of parenthood. Zara is a graduate of Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. Zara brings reporting rigor and real-life empathy in equal measure to her reporting and blogging. We'll dig into the mental load that comes with parenting in the modern era. We'll talk about the concept of default parents and default parenting. We'll talk about school-age transitions and how families underestimate the impacts that can have in the rest of their life. We'll even touch on the term trad wife. Never thought I would say that on this show, but there it is. And also, importantly, how employers can support caregivers regardless of what stage of parenting or life they're in, and how that can pay off for their companies and for society as a whole. This is a show that is dedicated to all of the parents out there who have probably said a lot of the things you're going to hear on this show in private. Maybe they've shared it in their own communities. Maybe they've even heard it on forums bigger than this, but they don't feel like they're getting through. And for those of my listeners who are leading companies or aspire to do so, the reason we're bringing this topic to you is because it's extremely important that we understand the nuances and complexities of modern day challenges in parenting, because it's something that is so foundational to people's everyday life that there's no way it can't affect how they show up in their jobs and how it affects their presence in our companies and our economy as a whole. Now, today's episode is very much focused on the mother's point of view. So for all the fathers listening to this show, including I know there are many single dads out there, we haven't forgotten about you. We'll see if we can find the right guest to come on and talk about the male perspective. But Zara is uniquely positioned to talk about the topics of parenting at a macro level, and specifically on the challenges facing mothers in the modern working world. So we'll start there, and our conversations will continue to evolve. And if folks have requests for guests they'd like me to bring on to explore other dimensions of this topic, you can always reach out to me at info@brianjmatos.com to recommend those guests, and we'll take a look into them. So for now, it's my honor to present to you my conversation with Zara Hanawalt. Zara, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
The topic of modern parenting is so big and so broad, we can go many directions with it. And it's been a request from our listeners who are probably dealing with this in their own life to see if we can take an analytical view of it. So we're going to do our best. I think you are a particularly uniquely qualified guest to speak on the topic. So let's start with where your attention is these days on the topic of modern parenting, the trends that you're seeing, maybe the trends you're experiencing that are most interesting to you. That might be unique to this generation.
Yeah, so I've been a journalist in the parenting space for about 10 years now, and I've seen several shifts over that past decade. I actually have only been a parent for nearly 7 years, so I was doing this before I had kids. But, when I started in the space, there was a lot of sort of normalization of parenting issues from things like pregnancy loss all the way up until, postpartum depression, mom rage, just the challenges of raising children that weren't really talked about much before, I would say, that 2015 sort of era. In the pandemic, things changed very dramatically. Suddenly, there was a real focus on advocacy. There was a real conversation about domestic labor, the mental load, the inaccessibility of childcare, those topics about just sort of the real structural challenges that parents are navigating, particularly in the United States. I will say also, my expertise is very geared to United States parenting. So I may talk specifically about that. And now I think we've kind of shifted again. And there was, the moment of gentle parenting. We're in a very intensive parenting cultural moment right now for many reasons. But it's been a lot of those shifts. And I think just the common thread is that parenting is a universal experience to some degree, but I think it's also so heavily dependent on the structure and the system that you're navigating. I think it's very dependent on the resources you have at your disposal, the support system you have at your disposal, whether you're doing it with a partner, whether you have a village, so many things like that. So I think that while the experience of being a parent is a very universal one, I think it's very, very affected by all of those factors.
So let's start with one of the areas that you just touched on, which is the access to information and the openness to discuss. I think in
Mhm.
previous generations, no matter where you are in the world, it's fair to say that a new parent gets a lot of advice and everybody has their opinions. A lot of it comes from within the family or from very close friends. And then the pendulum swung to this direction where you're getting advice from people you've never met, and not just one or two pieces of advice, a whole ocean of social media content, digital media content, mainstream media content. And the response I get a lot from the people that talk to me about this is they just feel overwhelmed. They
Mhm.
appreciate everyone wants to help and everyone wants to share their experience and what could be more personal than your parenting experience. But it's so much information that it's the opposite problem of maybe what parents in a different generation had, where they didn't have access to much information and they felt like they were only getting their own, maybe parents or grandparents' counsel. First of all, do you agree with that assessment that parents are inundated with information? And if so, how do you even make sense of it? Where do you begin in knowing who to listen to and what to tune out?
Yeah, there's absolutely just an overwhelming amount of information. I think if you are a millennial parent, chances are you've had someone from a previous generation tell you that you're so lucky that you can just Google, the rash your child is presenting with, or you can Google how to put your child in their car seat properly, for example. And there's definitely some truth to that. There is access to information right at our fingertips. But there's also this delivery of information that is coming to us. It's almost like when people used to go to the grocery store and people would come up to them and offer unsolicited advice. It's kind of like that every time you open up your phone. You open up social media and you instantly have someone telling you how to handle your child's tantrum. You have someone telling you that putting your child in daycare will ruin their attachment for life. You have somebody else telling you that being a helicopter parent will just completely inhibit your child and that they will never be able to get over the confidence issues that you instill in them. So it's just incredibly hard to really step away from this, and I think especially in 2025 so many of us turn to digital connection for escapism, for community, for a sense that we are not in this alone. And I think what it ultimately turns into in many cases is just this reminder that there are so many ways to get this not entirely right as a parent. There are so many opinions about how you're doing everything. And I think now there's been a lot of opinions from people who don't even have children themselves. I've noticed that cultural moment. So I think it's very, very hard. And I think that there is, the best thing about technology can sometimes be the worst thing. And I think parents are really in a moment of trying to thread that line between using their digital avenues for information and for connection and for resources without being completely just feeling like that is bleeding into their personal experience of being a parent. And I think that that is a really hard line to walk.
How do you think about, and what are the trends that you've been monitoring, the role of technology in parenting? Are you finding it that generally it's a positive because it's creating bigger communities and it gives parents with questions outlets? Or are you finding that the same kind of misinformation that is causing challenges in the political world, the business world, the economic world, all the other spaces is also leaking into parenting?
I think it's almost 50-50. I think that there are so many wonderful things about the digital world, about social media. I think for so many families, it's given them the ability to provide and to put food on the table for their children without missing out on time with them. I think there's so many mothers and fathers who have been able to make careers out of social media from their phones. And we live in, especially if you live in the United States, we live in a culture that really makes it nearly impossible to be a dual income family with two traditional jobs. So I think that that aspect of what social media has given so many families is invaluable. I also think that, 10 years ago, if you say had a miscarriage, you maybe felt very, very alone. And then all of a sudden, the conversation really entered the digital arena and people were talking about that on social media. So you realized you weren't alone. I think digital technology, I mean, even things like just being able to Google has given people so many answers to questions that they didn't have. At the same time, like we talked about, I think that sometimes that access to information can be just overwhelming and it can make you forget that there is an instinctive element to being a parent and that every child is different and that every family is different. That also, I think we have to talk about the fact that the algorithms prioritize these very extreme views. So often, what you will see are not the balanced, measured takes on what it is to be a parent. They are the very extreme voices. And that can absolutely warp not only our expectations of what it is to have a family, but also the standards we hold ourselves to.
Now, I know you mentioned you've spent a lot of your time reporting on and researching parenting trends in the U.S., but we'll kind of lump that together with Western culture, Western styles of parenting. Are there things in the Western culture, whether it's the U.S. or otherwise, that are uniquely challenging in this moment of modern parenting, or are the challenges that you see there anecdotally? You sort of see them everywhere, and it's not unique to one culture or another.
Yeah. So I have an interesting sort of perspective on this because I would say, an expert in parenting in the United States, but I come from an immigrant family. My parents are from India. So I was parented differently than I think a lot of people in the United States are. And the one thing I've noticed that is really, I would say, I can only speak to the United States here rather than the Western world at large, but there's a real hyper individualistic culture here. There is, I think that we have kind of forgotten how to be a village and how to be a community. I think children are very much seen as the responsibility of their parents and only their parents. And of course, as parents, we are the front lines. It is our job to take care of our kids, and it's nobody else's to the level that it is our job. But I think that when we have a community that embraces children and that allows children in public spaces and that welcomes families and that makes family life easier, that can really make parenting a much more pleasant experience. I was in Europe with my kids and we took them to the park. And there were, these very simple structures that were just surrounded by benches. So parents were able to sit and have their eyes on their children at all times. If you take your children to a playground in the United States, there are these incredibly complicated structures that can feel almost unsafe. There's nowhere for a parent to sit. So you're kind of like, running in between these like child sized structures and climbing, and you're, chasing your children at all times. And it's stressful and it's not enjoyable for parents. And I think that's emblematic of what it is to parent in the US in many ways. It's that there are just unnecessary obstacles thrown in your way, you know? And then if we want to get a little bit more macro with it, we can talk about things like the school day is what, maybe 9 to 3 for a lot of people. The workday is 9 to 5 or 9 to 6. So it's just, there's just so many things that parents in the US are just left to figure out on their own without community or structural support.
Now, as you think about some of those structural pieces, do you think that that is equally challenging for both men and women as they're parenting, or is it the burden overwhelmingly on women because of the traditional caregiver role that they have had both in Western society and, frankly, in most civilizations?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's, it falls disproportionately on women. I think that was something that we really didn't talk about until the pandemic era. And then now we have research to support this. We have research indicating that women take on a disproportionate amount of domestic labor. We have research to support the idea that women take on disproportionate amounts of childcare, that women are almost always the default parents in their homes, even when they are breadwinners. So yes, and it absolutely is. I think there's also this piece that we need to talk about where if you look at a mother's algorithm on social media, it's almost certainly going to be very different than a father's. I can see that in my own home. My husband and I have very different algorithms and feeds, and we are targeted in very different ways. I also think that there is just on a cultural level, there's a very different standard to which women are held and mothers are held. I think that if my husband takes our children out, he almost always is complimented. And if I take our kids out, we don't really get that. And that's not the greatest challenge of parenting by any means. It's not the underappreciation, but it does feel good to be appreciated. And it does feel good when your labor and your work and your time and your energy are praised. So, yeah, I think that
Ex-
unfortunately it's still not equal.
Expand a little bit on that concept of default parenting. I've seen you mention that in your writings, and it's certainly a topic of conversation in general. Define that for our audience who might be a little less familiar with our terminology in the West. When you say default parent, what are the parameters of that?
Yeah, so I can give you a little bit of an example of what that looks like in my home. On Monday, my children had the day off. My husband, he worked like it was a normal day. And, I had the kids. I took care of them. I had my schedule cleared up. They have a half day on Friday. I'm going to be the one who's with them. I take every sick day. I take anytime they have a day off from school, I take that. And it happens for a variety of reasons. I think that the wage gap plays a big role there. I think in a lot of cases, a family is prioritizing dad's career because that's the career that really keeps the lights on because, men do get paid more. That is a fact. But it can look any number of ways. It can look like that really kind of concrete, anytime there is a gap that needs to be filled, you are the parent that is filling it. It can also look like your kid's school is only going to call you if they're sick and they need to be picked up. It can also look like the doctor's office will only have your number on file and call you. It can really look a whole number of ways. And I think sometimes it is very obvious, like I think it is in my household. And sometimes it's a little bit more insidious. Sometimes you just notice that you are the one who is looking at your clock around that 3 o'clock hour and knowing that your children need to be picked up while your partner is maybe able to kind of get lost in what they're working on. So it can look any number of ways, but essentially it is that you are the safety net kind of at the bottom of the base. And if anything needs to be done for your children or your family, you're the one who is going to do it or have to set up somebody else doing it.
So, in some ways, that is not dramatically different than past generations where the mother was sort of assumed to be the head of the household, responsible for all the caregiving duties. What feels different now is that that expectation hasn't changed all that much. Maybe it's evolved a little bit, but now there's a whole set of other pressures that come with all of the responsibilities beyond parenting and beyond caretaking and the
Mhm.
balance you're trying to strike with that. Now, there's been a lot of talk about employers talking about being more flexible, talking about being more aware. Is that a reality or is that still just aspirational? But the realities are that mothers are still facing pressures in a professional environment that really haven't met the moment of the caregiving needs that they have?
I think the research speaks for itself, particularly in the United States. Return to office mandates are happening. Women are leaving the workforce in droves. The wage gap is widening. There's a lot happening right now that is taking back the flexibility that I think parents had gotten used to and that represented a real area of progress for working families. And we're seeing the ramifications of it in real time. We see that many, many women are stepping away from their paid work, and maybe they're doing it in favor of self employment. That's what I did. I left a full time job and I became a freelancer, and that was how I make it work for my family. And I think that if they are doing that, then that's wonderful. But I also think that we're navigating. I think that as parents in the United States in particular, it just feels like you are often stuck between a rock and a hard place where the economy doesn't allow for single income households the way it used to, yet the system is not set up for dual income households. So I think that there were promises of flexibility, particularly during the pandemic. I think while the pandemic was an incredibly dark time globally, I think a lot of families were able to find solutions and find ways to make the day to day work more effectively. I think we were finally seeing proof that the reason that many parents and many families felt incredibly strapped and stressed and like they were drowning, that it wasn't a personal failure, that it was something that we were all sort of experiencing quietly. But, I can only speak to my experience in terms of the flexibility piece. Like I said, I had to step away from the full time workforce in order to create the flexibility that I really wanted. But I've been contacted about jobs, and I've been told that there are going to be flexible arrangements. And then when I get into asking the specific questions, I realize that there really isn't the kind of flexibility that I think parents truly need if they are going to make this juggle of raising a family work without a village or without really spending their resources on outsourcing. So, I think everybody has a different experience. I think there are people who truly do feel supported at work and who truly do feel like they have the flexibility that they need. But I do think that that is a pretty rare experience.
I think it's an important topic you bring up. One of the reasons we highlighted this for our program, or we cover all kinds of big global trends, macro trends, economic trends, is that this is a society level issue. And as you said, we are seeing clearly in the data large numbers of childbearing age women leaving the workforce after they have their first or second child for a period of time. We'll get to that in a moment about what challenges that creates in sort of the resume gap and how to adapt to it. But these are not sort of issues that just happen in a small community. This is truly a macro issue that can have a huge drag on the entire economy,
Mhm.
especially in countries where the demographics are not particularly favorable. So you need everybody who's able bodied and able to work to contribute, and you're not seeing it. So as you've gone around and you've been doing your reporting and you've been talking with other parents, um, I feel like we see the tip of the iceberg, that the data always lags the reality, that we're
Yeah.
seeing little bits and pieces. Is it your sense as a reporter and as a researcher that there's actually a much more significant unemployment issue going on, especially with America's working mothers, that the data actually hasn't picked up yet, and we're facing a much bigger issue than we even think we are?
Yeah, I do. And I think that, many, many people, many advocacy groups have sort of been sounding the alarm for the past 5 years. And I think this is a pretty clear indication that most people haven't been listening. I think that we had all these solutions proposed on how we could stop this from happening, and those were not listened to.
So as we think about this resume gap issue, that we do have a large number, especially women, but there are some men too who are having to step away from the workforce for a period of time to be caretakers and then trying to reintroduce themselves into the workforce. It's not new. The challenge has been around for some time. But are you seeing novel approaches, how you can take the parenting experience and translate it directly into qualifications for any number of careers and roles, and potentially even giving yourself some advantages in certain roles?
What I have seen quite a bit is research to really support the idea that being a caregiver does make you a better employee. It really hones your skills in multitasking, in communication, in negotiation. There are so many things. There are even things like, I have two elementary school age children, and you look at how PTAs function. They're running businesses. They're, these groups of many women who are out of the traditional workforce who are still using the same skills that they would have honed and that would really take you far in a job, like management, like event planning, like raising money. Even if you're not keeping the money, you are still making money, right? You're fundraising. And I think that what we just need is a greater systemic acknowledgement of all that because the research is there. And I think people will tell you, I hired someone who was a stay at home mom for 10 years or a stay at home dad for 10 years. And that is my best employee because that's the person who understands how to anticipate needs. That's the person who knows how to self direct because this is someone who was essentially working without a boss for 10 years and who had to figure out how to structure their entire day and who had to figure out how to multitask and who had to set the schedules and set the routines and to manage the household and to make sure everybody within the household had their own responsibilities communicated clearly to them. So I think that there has been plenty of evidence to suggest that people with resume gaps are excellent hires. It's just up to hiring managers and companies to actually take those people seriously. Unfortunately, this coincides with a time when every job is probably, there's probably I don't even know how many applicants for each job at this point, but the job market is tough right now. And obviously, you need to be able to stand out among the competition. And unfortunately, I think that people with resume gaps are just kind of seen as undesirable hires at the moment.
Now, when we think about the gap between the employers and, parents, and so a lot of my listeners are folks who either own businesses or they're entrepreneurs. And so they follow these big trends and topics because it's a part of their job. Now, one of the things I've noticed about that group, they're not always the most in touch with everyday people. And that's okay.
Mhm.
That's this the world they live in. Oftentimes, they're people who have a lot of options for childcare. They often have really good options for extracurriculars. They have resources, is the point.
Mhm.
And so, what you'll hear sometimes from them is, I want to be helpful to the employees. I don't know where to start. I don't really know what they need. What are those things that would make it easier for working parents to work, in my company for 40 hours a week and so forth. So I know you can't speak on behalf of every parent, but just on the topics that you cover and what you get the most response to, what are a couple of the things that if you were advising a CEO of a major company that was having a challenge hiring working age parents, that you'd tell them, here's a couple of things that you ought to institute in policy that will immediately make a difference and make it much easier for working parents to give you what you're looking for out of them as employees?
Parental leave, I think, is the very obvious one. Not just maternity leave, but paternity leave as well. And then I think it is not so much a policy, but more sort of an ideology. But just give your people autonomy. Trust them to work in the parameters that work best for them. I think that if you are a parent, you might have to step out of the office for a little while, but if you can get your work done, I don't think that should be an issue. Or if you can log on after your children are asleep and do a few things, but I think just trusting people to figure out how they work best and what they need in order to make their life work alongside their work. I think in 6 years as a freelancer, I think the most valuable lesson I've taken away is that everybody kind of works differently and everybody works at their best capacity in different time frames, in different chunks of time. I think sometimes, stepping away and even just taking a walk can make you come back refreshed and recharged. And I think that if we apply that to parents as well, maybe going to pick up your child from school, maybe you just have to take that time in the middle of your day and then come back to your computer and be ready to go and to, you know, hit the gas pedal. That isn't a sign that you're not committed. It's a sign that you have other responsibilities outside of work and that those responsibilities are probably just going to make you better at your work. And in some ways, more committed to your work because the stakes are higher when you have a family to support. So I think it's just sort of reframing how we think about ambition and commitment and capability and devotion to the job.
Well, and then the needs evolve, right? I mean, the reality of somebody who has a 4-year-old at home and somebody who has a 14-year-old at home are not the same. The needs
Yeah.
change, schedules change and evolve. Is there a key point in the parenting journey where there is a particular need for extra support? I think there's always this assumption that obviously in the very beginning, this is why maternity, leave and paternity leave is available. But what I hear from a lot of parents is like, yes, that's important, but it's that transition between like preschool and kindergarten that's really tough,
Yeah.
or it's the transition from middle school to high school where there's just there's other things going on. What does your reporting and your research tell us about the different stages of parenting and how the needs really evolve from one stage to the next?
I think you said it. I think that the needs are just constantly evolving. And I think that's where this concept of just trusting employees comes into play, because I think it's kind of impossible to keep up with the exact way and the exact trajectory that parenting is going to follow. It is going to be 24/7 demanding in the beginning, and then as your kids age into school, it's going to be very erratic. They're going to need you more in some seasons, literal seasons, right? Kids need you more probably in the winter during cold and flu season, when they have holiday breaks and when they have holiday performances, then they need you maybe in April. Well, but no, even April is crazy. So I don't think it ever fully slows
Find the
down.
easy month.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's it. I think it's just really trusting parents. It's also parents have kids of multiple ages, so the demands are just going to be different. And I think that it's really impossible to lay out an exact trajectory of when parents need more support and when they need less. I think the general consensus is just like let parents figure out what they need and how they can make it all work best.
Now, I don't know how much of this is just a sort of a fad trend and also how much the algorithms are just messing with us, but we've heard a lot more in, let's say, the last couple of years. The trad wife term is what gets
Mhm.
thrown around on social media, but it's more or less a sort of a recognition of the benefits of a domestically based life where work is a secondary, maybe not even a consideration. Woman can stay home and just take focus on taking care of their family, taking care of their house. But you just said the reality of most of Western society is a one income household is really, really challenging for the vast majority of the society to have any standard of living. So how much of that do you think is sort of aspirational and sort of a almost a wistfulness about what used to be, maybe without understanding the complexities of what that world was like? And how much of it do you think is actually an authentic desire for some of those traditional values to come back if only there was an economic system that could support it?
Yeah, I think the tradwife content is very interesting. I think the one thing people have to remember about tradwife content in particular is that these are not people who are living like it's the 1950s. The backdrop of the 1950s, it flat out does not exist anymore. And actually, what these people are doing is leveraging an incredibly modern technology to gain financial independence and financial freedom, all while resting on this idea that financial independence for women is the thing that ruined everything for women, ruined the nuclear family, right? Women have always worked, and I think the tradwife idea rests on this idea of leisure. Domestic labor is not leisure; it's labor, it's work. And I think really the tradwife trope is a class fantasy more than anything else, because if you'll notice, you never see tradwife content filmed from a regular looking home. It's always a luxurious sort of aesthetic home. There's always magically no children in sight. I would just say, remember that the tradwife thing is a facade, much like the girl boss trope was a facade. I mean, I think I wrote somewhere that somewhere along the line, an Instagram graphic that said, "There's no elevator to success, you have to take the stairs," turned into a TikTok quote that said, "I manifested abundance and tapped into my feminine energy." And they were both written probably by someone with a very, very similar, proximity to wealth and just a level of privilege that enabled sort of that mindset without a real recognition of all of the systemic factors that don't allow most people to embrace that sort of ethos. So that was a little bit of a tangent, I think. But I do think a lot of this trad wife, the romanticizing of a bygone era, is really tied to this idea that women operated under that told them that they needed to aspire to have it all. And then I think we all kind of realized that having it all really means that you're the one who's doing everything, and that that's just exhausting. So I think that the pendulum just swung very strongly in one direction and it's swung back in the other now. And I think we need to kind of find the nuance.
So we've mentioned it a couple of times. You just mentioned it here how much class can be a part of this.
Yeah.
So on the upper extreme, one of the commentaries people will sort of, they'll never say it on the air. I've never heard anybody say it in a public forum, but privately they'll tell you when they have quite a bit of wealth and resources and access that they're really worried about raising spoiled kids.
Mhm.
That they're going to have such easy lives for their kids that they're not sure if they're going to be able to produce, good members of society who are not entitled. And then on the other end, you have people who are really strapped for resources who are just trying to figure out, how am I going to take care of the basic needs of my kid? So as you think about parenting and you write about the topic, it seems like the reality of somebody with a lot of resources, and there are challenges that they face, even if they're not resource challenges, are just so different. And their reality is so different than somebody who's just living paycheck to paycheck and trying to make sure their kid has the basics.
Mhm.
It feels like these two people live in such different universes that even the parenting conversation is on different planes. Do you see some commonalities where no matter how many or little resources you have, there are common challenges that every parent is facing? Or do you feel like these really are bubbles, and the reality of low income parents and upper income parents are so different that you're just going to end up having two different conversations? And that may be why we end up having, frankly, very different outcomes in our schools and in our society as a whole.
I think it's both. I think that the conversations, the concerns, the priorities, the day to day, all of that looks very different depending on your resources. But I do think that there are elements of parenthood that are very universal. I think, for example, you can outsource a lot. You can outsource childcare, you can outsource cooking, you can outsource cleaning. What you can't outsource is emotional presence. What you can't outsource is really being on top of your child's development and tapping into their needs. You really can't outsource parenting. You can outsource a lot of the work of parenting, but you can't outsource that emotional aspect of being a parent. You can't outsource time with your children and with your family. So I think that there are some of those universal threads that connect us all. I think if you ask, I don't know, 90% of parents if they want more time with their families, I think almost all of us would say yes, right? And I think that that is something that transcends class. I think the desire to raise safe, happy, healthy children transcends class. And I think that some of the ways that we do that can be very affected by our resources and our situations. But I think that there are some things that you can't outsource your way out of a child's sleep regression. You can hire someone to come and care for them through that sleep regression, but you can't pay your way out of that. So I think that a lot of the concerns and a lot of the goals are common, but it's just the day-to-day stuff that we are walking through that really can look very, very different.
I think the other concern that you hear a lot from, again, people won't say it on the air, but they'll say it, when they're having a private conversation is, and I don't know if this is really different now, but it's the question of what world am I preparing my child for? I think you mentioned healthy, happy, productive, that is a base case, but there was a time where a lot of folks really were trying to make sure that their kid had the best possible professional trajectory into the best schools if that's what they wanted to do. And so a lot of the investments were made to get them ready to have really good looking applications for that elite high school in town or the college that they wanted to go to. And now you've got some folks who are looking around the economy and wondering, like, I don't know what the jobs are going to be in 10 years. I don't know what I should
Yeah.
be preparing my child for. I'm not even sure how I should be teaching them to use the technology that I'm not that confident in. So this is
Mhm.
adding a whole nother layer of anxiety for parents. I'm curious how you think about this, even with your own family, and how you're exploring this with other parents. what world are we preparing today's kids for?
I wish I had an answer to that. I
Well,
think
how
you
do
were
you
spot
handle the
on.
uncertainty? How do you navigate that uncertainty?
I think you're spot on in saying that we just don't know what the world our children are going to inherit is going to look like. And we just had this conversation in my house, actually. I think I was, like I said, raised in a South Asian immigrant household. There were a few options that I could pursue, essentially, that were kind of presented to me, and they were all very kind of safe and stable options. Whereas many of my peers were told, do what makes you happy, do what. And I think that there is some sort of a middle ground there. I think kind of directing children, because I don't think most 18-year-olds really have the foresight to make the smartest decisions for their future, while also tapping into who they are and what they do well is really important. I also think that I don't know if my job is going to be around in 20 years. So am I going to steer my children into becoming digital journalists? No, I won't. But it is, I think, kind of an evolving conversation. Luckily, I have a lot of time before my kids get to that point where they have to make those decisions. But I do think as parents, we really do have to pay attention to the world around us and how things are evolving and how things are changing. And, I think that if you have the privilege to sort of set a little bit of a financial foundation for your children, I think a lot of us are taking that very seriously right now. And that is unfortunately just how class struggle persists generation to generation. I think millennials are sort of the first generation where generational wealth really has a profound effect on how you're living your life today. Um, I think, for so many millennials, they entered very unstable industries and they're only able to do it because they had some access to generational wealth. So I think that that is just going to become more and more of a thing as we go into the next generation. I think that the parents who are able to sort of establish a little bit of a financial footing for their children, those kids are going to live a very different life than their peers who didn't have that privilege.
I'm also curious how you think about and how the folks that you talk to and cover, how you all think about the education system. So one of the things that's really critically important when, kids come into someone's life, they all of a sudden get very focused on their schools, their
Mhm.
local schools. They think about all the different options out there. And this is another space that parents will say feels a little overwhelming. Like when I was a kid, I just went to the public school down the street and you hope for the best. And
Mhm.
now, there's some parents who want to or prefer to do more of a homeschooling or a non-traditional schooling, or there might be a private school that they can test into, or maybe they can afford. There's different attitudes now about what education should look like in the early childhood years and later. How are parents navigating this question of education today, in again an era where you don't know exactly what the future is going to look like? You're just trying to get the basics, so the kids have a foundation of learning.
Yeah, it's incredibly overwhelming. I think back to when I was growing up, and sure, there was word of mouth about this is a good school district, and this is maybe a school district that's not quite as resourced or not quite as, the results aren't quite as good as they say. But there weren't these lists that you could access at the tap of a button ranking all the schools. There weren't grades given to each school that you could just like look up within 5 seconds. There also wasn't all this online chatter about how public schools are like prisons for children and how you should homeschool your children. The homeschooling movement is really taking off, and I think it can be a wonderful option for a lot of families. I don't think it's right for every family, though, and I think that parents are feeling a lot of pressure if they're not going to homeschool their children. I see a lot of people who say I never ever expected to homeschool my kids, but now the pressure is really getting in my head of people saying that the outcomes are so much better, or that you're going to, children have more mental health issues if they're going through the public school system, or there's all these claims, right? And a lot of them are really not grounded in reality. But yeah, there's a lot to think about. There's also the element of, quite frankly, in the United States, every single day you send your children to school is scary because you don't know what will happen between the time you drop them off and the time you pick them up, because you know, the unspoken reality is that every parent is terrified that the unthinkable could happen to their kids. So there's that, and I think that that is one of the biggest stressors on modern day parents today is just this feeling that our world is not as safe as it should be for our kids and that we don't know the best way to shield them from one, some of the really, really dangerous things that happen in schools, but also some of the other things like the mental health issues, like the bullying, like, just exposure to different concepts that maybe you aren't comfortable with them being exposed to. I don't let my kids ride the school bus because I've just heard so many kids learn violence on school buses or learn profanity or say really cruel things to one another. So there is just this need to sort of understand what your child is exposed to now that I think wasn't as much of a concern in previous generations. And it is hard because you know, there's not everybody even has options, and when you do have options, they can be incredibly overwhelming to parse through.
Yeah. Let's talk briefly about technology with children. So we talked about technology's impact on the parents and how they're thinking about raising their kids, making their choices, answering questions. But when to introduce technology to your children has become, if not the most interesting conversation to listen to among parents, is certainly a hot topic of conversation. When to allow your kid to use the phone for the first time, when to use it as a phone, how to set the safety parameters, what tools and apps you're going to allow them to use and what you're not. When is the right time to have them learn this so that they don't fall behind, and when they're ready to get technology in the classroom, they're able to use it, versus when we're just overexposing them to information that they're not going to be able to use. I'm curious how you think about this topic of introducing technology in a healthy way to kids, because we've seen a lot of adults who didn't grow up with it, who adopted it later in life, who have extremely unhealthy habits, and
Sure.
trying to navigate how you even teach a child to approach these devices. Everybody seems to have a different answer to this, and I'm just curious what you think about it, and also what the people that you report on and that you follow, how they're trying to break down these decisions.
I think it's exactly what you said. I think that introducing technology to kids in a healthy way, and I think of it kind of as a similar conversation to the food conversation with kids. I think that if you are very, very restrictive with what you allow them to eat, that can backfire. I think if you're very, very restrictive with technology, that too can backfire. My personal stance is that the TV is fine and good, and I don't let my kids have iPads. I think that's a stance a lot of experts take in their homes as well. I try to limit kind of their exposure to short form content, like things that really scroll quickly, TikTok and the like, and have them watch movies or things like that. But I think that this is a really nuanced conversation. I think that it is entirely up to parents to figure out how they're going to approach that in a way that works best for their families. The reality is sometimes you have to make dinner, and it's not safe if your kids are, tugging on your arm while you're working on the stove. So they might have to watch a little bit of extra TV, and that's, in my opinion, not the end of the world. But I do think that it's just really figuring out how to approach this issue in your family in a way that works and in a way that feels like a balance between giving your children some exposure to technology so that one, it's not completely a novelty to them that they sort of glorify, but two, so that they'll understand how to use technology because it's a part of day-to-day life. It's a part of work, it's a part of socialization, it's a part of everything. So I do think that having the ability to navigate devices is important for kids, but I think that obviously there are limitations.
And so, one of the other things that brought us to this topic for this program, we've had a couple of episodes on demographics and the impacts those have on societies. It's unmistakable that in most of the Western world, women are having fewer children. They're having them later in life. Many of the pressures that we've talked about on this show influence those decisions.
Mhm.
And it feels like very few of those factors are actually getting better. So there's really no reason at this point to think that the trends are going to change all that much. Are there, in your view, some practical government level policy changes that could alleviate for those people who wanted to have kids younger? It wasn't like they didn't want to do that, they just couldn't do that. Or who have very serious economic concerns in their home that require them to push that decision back. The artificial issues that are changing some of the demographics of our society. Are there policies that can really make a difference in at a practical level, or do you feel like this is sort of just it's a phase that any society goes through, that when it reaches a certain point of wealth, you just don't have as many kids, and that's inevitable?
I think that federally mandated paid leave is crucial. I think that if you want people to want to have children, you have to make it less impossible once they actually have those children. So I think that's a big one, the paid leave piece of it. I think making childcare more accessible. I'm not an economist. I don't know exactly how we get there, but I think there at least needs to be some sort of consideration to the fact that childcare is inaccessible for many families. I think we need to better address the maternal mortality crisis in the United States. I think there's just a lot. I think that we need to create a world in which raising children doesn't feel so impossible or only possible for the people who really have resources. And I think that that's really what it all comes down to, is that in the United States, being a parent and having a family is next to impossible, and that parents often feel like they have no good options and no options that are sustainable. And I think if we present parents with a range of options, parenthood will be a much more attractive proposition.
What are some of the other things that you think would be helpful? Again, knowing we've got some folks who listen to the show who would self admit that they're not always up on issues of everyday people. What are some other things that you just like, if you had a business leader, an entrepreneur, somebody who will hopefully be a future leader of large organizations, what are some things you would want them to know about your experience as a parent and about the experiences of your generation, that maybe you don't have perfect solutions for them, but you'd want them to understand what ordinary families are going through in 2025?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would want them to know that in many ordinary families, it doesn't make sense for both parents to be active in the workforce because the costs of childcare are so high that in many cases people can't afford to work. And that's an issue that we really need to be taking seriously. I think that people need to understand that, like I said earlier, being wanting to be more present with your family doesn't mean that you're not ambitious. It doesn't mean that you're not a hard worker. It doesn't mean that you don't take your role seriously. It just means that you have a life outside of work. And I think that's a good thing. I think that who we are outside of work can only make us better at our jobs because it enriches us with all these other experiences and all these other skills. Yeah, I think those are kind of the two main things.
It's a fascinating phrase, can't afford to work.
Yeah.
I mean, that it runs counter to so much of what I think people assumed, that any sort of modern capitalist oriented system would always incentivize work, and that work would
Hmm.
have a better standard of living. And I think what you're saying and what so much of the research tells us is that work can actually reduce your standard of living at a
Yeah.
certain stage of your life if you're trying to raise kids, but the costs that go into it, you'd be better
Hmm.
off personally, economically. And so we have a problem when we have a situation where a personal economic decision is actually contrary to what would be economically desirable to have more people actively engage in the workforce. I think that's an important red flag that I don't know is fully appreciated among people who are running businesses and are trying to think about how to grow them and trying to figure out why they can't keep their workforce or why they can't grow it.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't think that's something that AI can automate away.
No, I don't either.
You've been very generous with your time. I know you've done a lot of writing. You have a lot to offer on this topic that goes well beyond what we covered today. If people would like to learn more about you, your work, what's the best place for them to follow you and read some of what you've published?
Yeah, you can follow me on social media at Zara Hanawalt, ZaraHanawalt. I also co host a parenting podcast called Do You Want the Truth? So you can check out the podcast, follow us on social media, Do You Want the Truth Pod? And I've also started a project for people who are in the sandwich generation, and it's called the Millennial Sandwich. So, people who are caring for young children and also maybe caring for aging parents or even caring for partners or other family members, but basically people who have multiple caregiving responsibilities across generations. This is a very millennial issue, if you will. A lot of stats to back up the fact that many millennials are finding themselves squarely in the sandwich generation. So we are trying to shed a light on that and create a little bit of community and bring a little bit of humor to caregiving in the sandwich. So you can find us at the Millennial Sandwich.
Excellent. We will include links to all of these on the description of this program. We'll also make sure that we cross promote on our website. I always love supporting other podcasters who have very important communities. I think those are really great topics, and so many people are dealing with both, especially the sandwich generation piece. My goodness, how many folks are feeling the burden of caretaking for multiple generations.
Yeah.
So thank you for doing those shows. I hope our listeners will follow along. There's probably plenty in our audience who are in the same boat. And thank you for taking time to speak about this very important topic with our audience.
Thank you so much for having me.
There are those who will listen to this interview and feel the contents were self evident. How could anybody not know the challenges of modern parenting? And some may find my questions to be too elementary, too basic. I can imagine some thinking, how did he not know the reality of this? Well, if that's how you feel after listening to the interview, I just want you to know the content of this podcast wasn't necessarily for you, but it was advocating for you. Because there are hundreds of thousands of people out there and thousands who listen to this show for whom this information was new, or at least it's the first time they'd focused on it, really listened, and considered what the challenges of modern parenting mean for individuals in our economy, in our society. Maybe for the first time, they had a deeper appreciation for the parents that they know in their own life. You'd be surprised how many people, for any number of reasons, from different socioeconomic backgrounds to simply being too busy in their own affairs, don't really stop to think about what modern parenting is like. And the reason it was so important, I thought, to bring this topic to this program is because it is an underlying factor in so many of the megatrends that we cover on this show. We've been talking about demographic evolutions, changes, challenges across the world, especially in Western civilization and westernized worlds, for a long time. And the potential challenges that will cause to the economies that were built on a consistent growth in population and economic systems and governments that are built on young people contributing enough to take care of an aging population, both directly and indirectly through taxes. And those entire systems are now jeopardized because the birth rates have fallen, because populations are aging. And this isn't something that's aspirational that will happen in the future. It has already happened. And the implications of it are still unfolding in front of us. It's also important to note that for anybody in the business community or anybody who's making policy in government, these are issues that you're going to have to face as an employer or as people with constituents who are seeking different answers to modern challenges. So there's a couple of quick points that I want to make as we wrap up the show today. Number one, I do think we covered in the interview the concept of it takes a village. One of the reasons that it seems like more parents feel more alone, despite all the connectivity of modern social media and modern technology, is simply because the idea of it takes a village to raise a kid, that an entire community comes together, has faded into some levels of individualism where we view the parent next door as not somebody we're accountable or responsible for. We leave them on their own. Not necessarily for a negative reason, not even because we don't care, but there is a sense in the society that we should just leave people alone, that they don't need help, they don't want help, and it'd be rude to ask them if they do. I think it's important that mindset begin to shift, because the reality is no matter how good of a parent anybody may be, everybody could use some help. And communities are stronger when they rally around and protect their young. This is true throughout all animal groups in society, in the world, in the ecosystem of the world, in the environment. And it is true of humans as well. And so it's important not to think of parenting just as an individual expression, but as a group exercise for an entire family, multi-generations, and for an entire community, even those who didn't have children themselves, for any number of reasons. They still have their own obligations and their own responsibilities in their community to those who do have kids. And they can contribute in any number of ways, from helping out the parents in their life to being teachers, being coaches, being volunteers, being mentors. Everybody has a role in developing the next generation, even in the workplace. Now, at a more foundational level, our economies and our societies have evolved in a way that we really can't afford to have any able-bodied working person not contributing in one way or another to our economies, in formal ways, where they are paid in exchange for their labor and hours, or even for their ideas. The economy has evolved around the world in such a way that women are now, in many cases, more highly educated and skilled than men, either equal to or greater than, which means any woman who feels like they can't afford to work, as we talked about in the interview today, they are focusing on their parental duties, but because they're pulling back their contributions in the workplace, in the formal economy, all of society suffers for that. And if you're an employer, if you are a policymaker, if you are somebody who's growing a business or worried about the future of your city, your state, your town, your county, this is important to understand. If you think AI is going to save you because the productivity gains will allow you to get away with fewer workers and that will make up the gap of the missing parents in the workforce, I think you've got a lot of expectation overload. AI will be helpful. It will allow for a productivity gain and boom, but it probably will not be able to create productivity as fast as the workforce losses due to demographic changes. We're going to need a ton of productivity gains from every individual remaining in the workforce, working age individuals, to contribute enough for the huge challenges that come with an aging population. It's also important to note that this is not an optional issue of supporting parents. It is a requirement. It is a necessity for the continuity of countries and societies and economies. This is not an issue that can be kicked down the road or put off. And we can't afford to have ideas about it's always been hard to parent, have people get over it. You know, they'll find their way through it like everybody else did. Well, to some degree, that may be true, but if we have large numbers of people who fundamentally feel that they not only have to choose between their professional and their parental life, but that they have no choice but to leave the workforce just so they can raise a family, it is going to have serious negative effects that are immeasurable at every level of society and will affect everyone. So for those who are in policy-making positions, for those who want to hire a workforce and want to grow as an employer, who believe that this question of how to support parents is still an optional nice to have, I hope today's episode helps to shake you into the reality that it's not a nice to have. It's a requirement. It's a necessity. Answering the questions of supporting parents in the modern era. And this is not to say that this is a government-led or public policy-led answer. All of society has to come together to answer this. All of us have a role in answering the call. And it's not simply just having and raising your own kids. Importantly, it's about how do you help and how do you contribute to society as a whole by helping all the kids who are already there. I also think it's important that those in policy positions make this a priority and understand it's a competitive advantage. For businesses that can figure out this balance to support the parents of today, you are going to get some of the most skilled, talented labor that the market has to offer. You will be able to have those folks stay with you through the challenging years of their lives. And as those kids get older and they're able to focus even more of their efforts on their professional endeavors, you will gain the benefits of having had them all along. That becomes a competitive advantage in an environment where productivity is important, and the more experience that you have from the people, the better use you can make of the technology that's making everything a little bit easier and a little bit better. Now, I know this is a topic that will draw a lot of interest and a lot of conversation and response, and I welcome it. But I want to clarify, today's show is not about parenting tips or advice. My commentary segment is not about advocating for any specific public policy solution. It is to simply raise awareness of the everyday decisions that parents feel like they have to make, and to extrapolate from that what those implications and how serious those implications can be for every other trend that we cover. Every other mega trend that there is affected by this fundamental issue. I welcome your commentary. I welcome your feedback. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please leave comments under this video. I hope you'll like and subscribe as well. If you're following us on a traditional YouTube channel like Spotify, iHeartRadio, or any number of other podcast platforms, feel free to reach out to me directly through email. info@brianjmatos.com is the easiest way to do that. If you're picking up this podcast from a social media platform, you can always direct message me, leave comments, or respond there. And I want to make sure that we get a chance to answer your questions. So feel free to send those, and I'll take to the YouTube channel where we do exclusive Q&A from listener questions to address my reactions to some of your questions. And in this case, if there are just some responses, even if you don't have questions, I'd love to hear from you, especially from listeners around the world who might have a different take. The perspective you heard today was relatively westernized and Western-centric and really U.S.-centric. So if there is feedback or thoughts or challenges from other parts of the world, we would love to share that with our global audience. As always, thank you for listening. I hope you found this program enlightening, and I look forward to talking to you again very soon on our next episode. In the meantime, I hope you will all stay curious.